Alrighty, in this video we're going to start off by finishing out our game store. So we've already finished our lobby, our user, and our app store, but we haven't yet done our game store. And it's pretty straightforward, so we're just going to do this all just in one go because we can just do that really easily. Then all we'll have left to do is actually hook up the actions on the server side. So I'm going to start off with implementing or changing our default views. Our default views, we're going to set ID to null, title to null, step to step disposed. For options, we're going to just leave that as an empty object. For players, we're going to leave that as an empty array. For messages, we're going to leave that as an empty array. And for round, we're going to set round to null. Then for our default player view, we're going to set our hand to an empty array. We're going to set our, actually, we're going to put our ID to null, I think. And our stack is going to be set to null. Now for our actions. So our actions, I'm going to go ahead and just do this real fast. I'm going to import our socket. Actually, before we do this, I'm going to jump up to the top just to get this out of the way. I'm going to import create view money from backpack lib stores. Then for our requests, I'm just going to dispatch them all to the socket. So socket.emit action. Actually, no. Whoops, I forgot the lambda, but that's fine. I'm actually going to go ahead and say const pass through action equals, and then it's going to be an action goes into socket emit action. And then I'm just going to set all of our actions to our pass through action. So they'll all be pointing to the same function. All that function does is passes the action through to the socket. I definitely could add an additional method onto my socket, or maybe wrap the socket into a different class so that I don't have to say emit action, action, but I'm not going to worry about it. Now for our view, we're simply going to say view equals create view, passing in our dispatcher, our a view game, and then our default view of default view. Then for our player view, we're going to do basically the same thing, except we're going to pass in our dispatcher, but then we're also going to pass in view player, and then the default player view. And that's it, I think. All these other guys they're fine the way they're currently implemented. So all we're doing is passing through all these game actions. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to stub out a few classes in the server. I'm first going to add in some server-only actions. And that's going to be export const game disposed equals game disposed. Export const game disposed, game ID goes into type of game disposed, game ID. Then we'll need an export const player disposed equals player disposed. Export const player disposed equals game ID, player ID goes into type is player disposed, game ID, player ID. Then we're going to go ahead and say export const game summary changed equals game summary changed, and then export const game summary changed equals game ID. How about game ID and summary goes into type is game summary changed, game ID and summary. So these internal actions will be used to notify, let's say for example, the lobby that a game was destroyed. So that it should remove it from its array, or it will notify that the game summary changed. Let's say a player joined the lobby, and so it has to update, send to all the clients saying, okay, this person is now in this game, or maybe they left, so you would do the opposite. Next up, let's go ahead and stub out our player. So in model, I'm going to create a new file called player.js. Now, player is going to be a room, so we're going to import Lodash first, then we're going to import our actions as a from actions. Then we're going to also go ahead and import a validator, which we'll use later. Then we're going to import room base from backpack lib room. Then I'm going to say export const hand size is 10. Export class player extends room base. For our view, I'm simply going to return an object with ... this summary. Hand is going to be this hand.slice. And then stack, we're just going to set stack to null for now. Then I'm going to say get summary. And summary is going to go ahead. Actually, I don't want to pass in summary here. I don't want to copy through summary. I just want to say ID is going to be this.id. Because summary is going to contain information that is going to be present for every... So view is your private look into the player. Summary is going to be the public, how you appear, what your score is, what your name is, and so on. So ID is this ID, name is this name, score is this score, and I'm going to do is czar is going to be false, is playing is going to be false, and then is winner is going to be false. Then let's do our constructor, which will take in a game and an ID and a name. And we'll first invoke our super constructor with view player as our view type. This name equals name, this ID equals ID, this game equals game, this score equals 0, this hand is empty array, and then this is disposed is going to be false. Next up, I'm going to create a really quick small method called add points. Points, which will simply be this score plus equals points. Or rather, this tick, this score plus equals points. And then there'll be a bunch of other methods that we'll write later. But for now, the only method that I'm concerned about is dispose. So I'm going to say on dispose, I'm going to say if we're already disposed, then simply return. Then I'm going to say this hand is array, this is disposed is true. Then I'm going to say this.game.app.dispatcher.emit a player disposed, passing in this game ID and then this ID. So this is how we'll notify everyone on the server that a player has been destroyed. Remember, emitting to this dispatcher, the app dispatcher, does not send anything to socket.io. The app dispatcher is private and internal to the server only. The only time it gets sent to socket.io is if we emit an action to a client object instead. But with that, we should be able to jump into the game and stub that guy out a little bit. So jump into model again and create a file called game.js. I'm going to go ahead and import Lodash. I'm going to import our actions. I'm going to import our validator. So back shared validation. I'm going to import our room base from lib room. I'm going to import our player from player. And then I'm going to go ahead and say export const minimum players equals 2. Generally, you would want a minimum players of 3. But that's how you would generally play this game, because 2 players is kind of silly because you would always be choosing the other person's card all the time. But for testing purposes, we'll keep that at 2. Then I'm going to export class game extends room base. Then let's do our view. Our view will simply be ID is this ID, title is this title, step is this step, options is this options, players is going to be this.players.map. Player goes into player.summary. Remember, this view is going to be broadcast to everybody in the game. So we don't want to send in private player information, but we do want to send in their summary. Messages is going to be this.messages.slice. Round is going to be this.round and this.round.view. And then timer is going to be this timer. So that's the entirety of the game view. Then I'm going to say get is disposed is going to return this.step equals a step disposed. Then let's write a constructor. He's going to take an ID, a title, and an app. His super will say a.viewGame. This ID is ID. This title is title. This app is app. This players is empty array. This step is a.step setup. This messages equals array. This round equals null. This options, and that's not how you spell round. this options is going to be an object with a score limit of 5 and a sets of app.cards.sets.map s goes into SID. So the default sets is going to simply be an array of all of the available set IDs. You might want to consider doing something where maybe in your actual set data you can include like a flag called like is on by default and then like true. And then inside the game model right here, only pick up sets that are on by default. You could do something like that if you wanted to, but I'm just gonna have all sets be available. And then I'm gonna go ahead and listen for players being destroyed. So I'm gonna say app.dispatcher.on a player disposed, and then it'll take in a game ID and a player ID. I'm going to say if game ID does not equal this ID, return, then const player index equals -- find index, this dot players, ID is player ID. If player index is -1, then return. Otherwise, go ahead and say tick, and tick this dot players dot splice player index 1, and then this app dispatcher emit a game summary changed, this ID, this summary. So this will notify anybody who's listening to the game summary changed event, such as the lobby, that the summary has been changed. Then let's go ahead and say add player ID name. I'm going to say this dot ensure active. We will implement ensure active in a moment here. Then I'm going to say const player equals new player, this followed by ID followed by name. Then I'm going to say this tick on this dot players dot push player, because we're modifying the view here. Then I'm going to say this app dispatcher emit a game summary changed, this ID, this summary. And then finally return player. So you might want to add other things to the summary, such as oh whoops, did I never write the summary? I never wrote the summary property. Let's go ahead and do that real fast. I'm gonna scroll down for what we have right now so you guys can catch up. But let's go ahead and do our summary. So I'm gonna scroll up here to the top and say get summary, and it's simply gonna return ID is this ID, title is this title, and players is this map this player's map. Player goes into, and we're simply going to pass in player.name. So, and maybe we might want to move our summary to above is disposed. So the summary will, and you can add additional stuff. You might want to add the current step that the game is in into the summary so that people can see if the game is in progress or not, and so on and so on. But I'm just going to leave it simple right now. Now let's scroll down, and after add player, I'm going to say send message client message, this ensure active, and then this tick, and we're simply going to say this dot messages dot push. And we're going to say index is this messages length +1, name is client.name, and message. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and write set options. I'm just getting the really easy methods out of the way first. Set options is going to say this ensure active, and then we're going to say this tick, this dot options equals options. Now, we could do validation here. Well, actually, what I want to do is I want to set our options to a specific object. That's going to say score limit is going to be options.scoreLimit, and then sets is options.sets. That way, if the client sends in an options object that has a bunch of stuff that we don't want to set, it'll whitelist out the only values we want to set. But what we could do is we could do some validation. So I can say const validator equals new validator, and I can say validator.assert, and we'll assert that options.scoreLimit is greater or equal to 3, and options.scoreLimit dot score limit is less than or equal to, I don't know, 50. Score limit must be between 3 and 50. And then I can say if validator dot did fail, then return validator immediately. Otherwise, tick and then return the validator again. So that's how you would validate your options here. Okay, so then what I want to do is go ahead and implement our dispose and our ensure active. So dispose is going to be if this step is already step disposed, then return. Otherwise, set our step to disposed. Oh, come on. Set our step to disposed, then tick. Actually, we could tick and then have that inside of it, or tick without it inside of it. It doesn't matter either way, because remember, tick can also take in no action, and it'll just perform the tick there. And then this this app dispatcher emit a game disposed this.id. And then finally, ensure active is simply going to say if this is disposed, then throw new error, game has already been disposed. And that is the stub for our game. So now what we can do is we can implement our lobby and have our lobby have us be able to create games and join games and so on. So let's jump into our lobby. I'll scroll through this one more time. Inside of our lobby, we're going to go ahead and start off by importing our game from the game model. Then, let's see. I'm going to say down here, we already have next game ID. But then I'm going to do is I'm going to say app.dispatcher.on on a game disposed game ID goes into this.remove game ID. And then a.game summary changed is simply going to say this tick. Now for our games, right now what we could do is actually, I'm going to go ahead and have the game summary be what's sent in from the games property. But with that, let's go ahead and jump down here and write our create game function. Create game title. We'll say const game equals new game, this next game ID plus plus, title, and then this.app. And then I'm going to say this tick, this.games.push game, and then return game. Then remove game, game ID, is simply going to say this tick, low dash dot remove, this game's ID is going to be game ID. And then we'll have get game by ID. Game ID, which will simply return low-dash.find this game's ID is game ID. And that's pretty much it for the lobby. So we can scroll up and scroll down on this guy. Now let's go ahead and write our handler that's going to handle the create game button. So jumping into our client, it's not going to be located in our game's handler. Remember, this is only these handlers are only for when you're actually in a game. But you'll be able to say create game from any point, whether or not you're in a game or in a lobby. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do... actually, we're going to leave this for the next video. Take a small break. And in the next video, we'll go ahead and implement the concept of joining a game and creating a game. And with that, we'll see you guys then.